The story I am going to tell you is about a house, a family, and a room that had been locked for decades. No one dared to open it, no one dared to ask why it remained sealed. It was simply known in whispers as the room that should never have been opened. For years, the room existed like a shadow in the house, a silent presence that demanded no explanation and gave no answers. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing back to the surface, and this one was no different. The story begins with a young man named Daniel, who inherited his grandparents' old countryside home after their passing. Daniel had always loved visiting the house as a child. He remembered playing in the wide garden, listening to his grandmother's bedtime stories, and eating freshly baked bread in the cozy kitchen. But there was one thing he never forgot: the door at the end of the hallway on the second floor. It was always locked, and every time he had asked about it, his grandmother's face would grow pale, and she would simply say, "That room is not for you, Daniel. Never try to open it." As a child, he obeyed. But now, as a grown man of 27, standing inside the old creaking house with the keys of the entire property in his hands, curiosity began to stir once again. His grandmother had passed away 2 months earlier, and his grandfather many years before that. The house was his now, and the locked room felt less like a forbidden mystery and more like an unanswered question waiting to be solved. Daniel spent the first week cleaning and organizing the house. Dust had gathered on the furniture, cobwebs hung in corners, and the once lively home seemed suffocated by silence. He carefully polished old photo frames, most of them showing his grandparents in their youth, smiling with pride in front of the very house he now stood in. But one thing he noticed struck him: there were very few pictures of his mother. In fact, none after the age of 20. She had died when Daniel was only 4 years old, so his memories of her were faint, just a gentle voice, the warmth of her hands, and a lullaby she used to hum. His grandmother rarely spoke about her, and whenever she did, her eyes filled with an unexplainable sadness. On the 8th night, Daniel was sitting in the living room when a storm began to rage outside. Rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rolled in the distance. He was about to head upstairs when a strange noise echoed through the hallway, a faint creaking, like wood shifting under pressure. His eyes shot toward the staircase, and his heart skipped when he realized the sound was coming from upstairs, near the forbidden room. His curiosity burned stronger than his fear. With a candle in hand, Daniel climbed the staircase. The corridor was dark, and shadows seemed to dance across the walls. When he reached the end of the hallway, he saw the door, the very same door from his childhood. To his shock, it was no longer fully closed. The storm must have loosened it, for it stood slightly ajar, as though inviting him inside. Daniel's breath quickened. His grandmother's warning rang in his ears: "That room is not for you, Daniel." But his hand moved on its own, pushing the door open. A gust of stale air greeted him, carrying with it the scent of dust, old wood, and something else, something faintly sweet, almost like faded perfume. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by his candlelight. The walls were painted a soft shade of blue, though time had cracked the paint. Against the far wall was a bed, neatly made but clearly untouched for years. On the bedside table was a photo frame turned face down, and on the desk across the room were stacks of old letters tied with ribbon. The room didn't look haunted or frightening. It looked preserved, as though someone had once lived here and everything had been left exactly as it was. With trembling hands, Daniel picked up the photo frame and turned it over. His heart clenched when he saw the picture. It was of a young woman smiling warmly at the camera. She had the same eyes as him, the same nose, the same gentle expression. It was his mother. He recognized her instantly from the few photographs he had seen growing up. But what confused him was how young she looked in this picture, as though it had been taken only a year or two before her death. Daniel's chest tightened. Why would his grandparents lock away a room filled with his mother's belongings? Why keep it sealed all these years? He moved toward the desk and untied the ribbon around the letters. The first envelope trembled in his fingers as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated nearly 30 years ago. It began simply: "My dearest, if you are reading this, it means the truth can no longer remain hidden." Daniel frowned, his eyes darting across the words. The letter wasn't signed, but as he read further, his heart began to race. It spoke of a young woman who had fallen in love against her parents' wishes. It described how she had met a man from the city, a man her family disapproved of because of his background. The letter spoke of secret meetings, of promises of marriage, and of a child that came too soon. Daniel's hands shook. A child, the letters continued, painting a story of heartbreak and betrayal. The young woman had been forced by her parents to return home, her lover forbidden to ever see her again. Out of shame and fear of gossip, the family kept her hidden away in that very room during her pregnancy. She had written letters to her lover that were never sent, letters filled with hope, pain, and longing. As Daniel pieced together the letters, his world began to tilt. The young woman in the letters was his mother. But the timeline didn't make sense. His mother had married his father, hadn't she? That's what he had always been told. Yet these letters hinted at another story, one his grandparents had erased. Finally, at the bottom of the stack, he found one last letter, its paper yellowed with age. His eyes stung as he read it. I don't know if I'll ever see you again. They tell me the baby will be raised as their own, and that no one must ever know the truth. But I hear him cry at night, and I know he is mine. If he grows up and ever wonders, I hope one day he finds this room and understands. My Daniel, my sweet boy, forgive me for not being the mother you deserved. The candle nearly slipped from Daniel's hand as the words blurred with his tears. His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, clutching the letter to his chest. All his life, he had believed his grandparents had saved him, raised him after his mother's untimely death. But now he knew the truth. His mother hadn't died when he was 4. She had been forced into silence, locked away, her love for him hidden behind closed doors. The realization struck him like lightning. The woman he called mother, in his memory was actually his grandmother. His real mother had been alive, trapped in that very room, until she faded away in despair. His childhood lullabies, the soft voice that hummed to him at night, had not been his grandmother's, but his mother's, reaching out to him from behind the door. Daniel wept, the storm outside raging as though the heavens themselves mourned with him. The truth was unbearable, yet it was his to carry now. He had found the secret, the reason the room was never to be opened. Not because it was haunted, but because it held the weight of love denied, of silence imposed, of a truth too painful to confront. That night, Daniel lit a candle in the room and stayed there until morning, surrounded by his mother's letters, her perfume still lingering in the air. He whispered to her, promising that she was not forgotten, that her voice had finally been heard. And so, the room that should never have been opened became the place Daniel visited most often. Not as a forbidden space, but as a sanctuary of truth, the place where a son finally met the mother he had lost not to death, but to secrecy. The house was never the same again. The silence was filled now, not with fear, but with memory. The letters were preserved, the photographs framed, and the story that had been buried for decades was finally told. And Daniel, though broken, found strength in knowing that love, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds a way to speak, even from a room that should never have been opened.